Okay, so we're almost done with the brain. So now what we're going to talk about is a system in the brain that contains more than one structure. So when we talk about the limbic system, it is in the nervous system, but it contains more than one structure in the brain. And it actually combines unconscious with the conscious responses that can cause emotional reflexes, including things like emotional reflexes to fear, to anger, and then also sexual responses, which also can be a reflex. And so the reason why it is called limbic is limbic means ring. So if we were to look at the structure, this is a diagram from your textbook, and it is a ring-like structure in the brain. And notice that it also contains the olfactory bulb, because the olfactory bulb, when we think about how to describe smells, it's very hard for us to consciously think about smells and give them a name and to describe them, as compared to say, for example, what does that sound like? Or what does that look like, right? You never say, well, what did it smell like in your classroom, right? So the olfactory bulb oftentimes is responsible for our responses to unconscious stimuli. And so it could be including pheromones that are produced by one person. So the way a person smells, you might consciously be attracted to a person based upon their smell, but you're not consciously smelling them. It just kind of makes you feel good to be around them because of that unconscious response. So the olfactory bulb is part of the limbic system. So we talked a little bit about the hippocampus. Does anybody remember what the hippocampus? This is memory. And so oftentimes when we have a memory, we associate an odor with it. So when I think about grade school and my classroom at grade school, I can smell the soap, right? Or I can smell glue, right? So oftentimes our memories are associated with smells. There's another structure that you might hear of in the media because they like to talk about the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for our emotional reflexes for anger. And so if you have, or fear, so the ability to like run away. So if like somebody grabs you from behind, it's your amygdala that makes you go, right? And like try to get away from them, right? So that is kind of an unconscious emotional reflex. So one of the interesting things about the limbic system is it does allow us to respond to stimuli really, really quickly. Find my notes here. Okay, so respond reflexively to stimuli. So a reflex is quick, right? And we don't have to think about it. And so oftentimes we also have what are referred to as emotional reflexes. Right? So this would be like fear, anger. Those two would be really useful in terms of being reflexive because that could allow us to protect ourselves, right? But also sometimes we have emotional or sexual arousal that could also be kind of like a emotional reflex.
What about like sad emotion?
I don't know if I've ever, I don't think sadness is something that, I don't know. That's a good question.
Just because I was thinking like of a funeral setting. Like I've been to a funeral that I was just being a supportive person and I like seeing everybody else cry, like made me cry.
Right.
You know, like I
so maybe sadness would be one
considered a reflex.
Right. And so there is this idea, interesting idea, about emotional intelligence. And there was a really good book. Now there's all kinds of stuff about emotional intelligence, but there was a good book written by a Goldman. He was a medical doctor, and he talked about the wiring in the brain that allows us to have these emotional reflexes. And oftentimes these emotional reflexes are laid down in childhood. So when we become adults, we could still have these reflexes to stimuli that no longer serve a purpose because we are more in control of our environment. So a good example of this would be like if you were from a childhood where anybody who appeared drunk was dangerous, right? And so then growing up as an adult, you go out to a party and there's people that are drunk and you have a fear response to that, like you do not like to be around people that are drunk. And that could be kind of an emotional reflex. So you could override these emotional reflexes, and that's what is referred to as emotional intelligence. So if you understand why you have reflexes, you could potentially override them and consciously say, oh, well, I no longer have to be fearful of drunken individuals in general, right? So I don't have to have that response. So if we look at the way that this works in our body, we can do kind of an experiment on rats that is kind of typical of psychological experiments where you condition them using classical conditioning with two different stimuli. So you could give them a bell and a shock, right? So both of these stimuli are going to go into the central nervous system and they're going to be incorporated by the thalamus, because remember that the thalamus is a relay station for sensory information. So that thalamus could send the signal out to the hypothalamus. And remember, the hypothalamus is still unconscious, and that it could also send a signal to our cerebral cortex. Right? So the hypothalamus, that pathway is fast. And this pathway is slow. So one thing that the hypothalamus can do is it could then send the signal out to the body that you have like an increased heart rate, right? Increased breathing rate. So you have a fight or flight response. And oftentimes that will start even prior to or even before you consciously perceive the information, right? So we could go in here and we could start to take things away. So we could take the shock away, right? And then we have learned to associate the sound of the bell with something that is painful, and the rat will have a fear response to it, right? You can also take away this right here. So you could cut the connection between the ear and the brain and make the rat deaf, right? So that the cerebral cortex is no longer able to consciously perceive sound. And so what this means is that a deaf rat that has been trained this way will still have the response. So you can still ring the bell and they'll still have that emotional reflex because it doesn't require them to consciously perceive it. So you can have emotional reflexes to stuff that you are not. So you could be walking down this road and you could just all of a sudden become like, oh, what was that all about? Oh, the hair on the back of my neck just stood up. I don't know what that was about. But it could be a reflex that you're not, a sensory stimuli that you're not even consciously aware of. So that's kind of crazy, I think. That's kind of interesting. And it's from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense, right? Is that we would build these connections for these reflexes to protect ourselves. But also, when we look at sexual arousal, the same kind of thing happens. And so being emotionally intelligent about your sexuality is really super important. So say, for example, if you're a person and you see the genitalia of the opposite or of the same sex, let's say it's the same sex, and you're like, ooh, I feel weird, that does not make me feel comfortable, right? And that's probably because you had an emotional reflex to that stimuli, right? And so you can override that. You can say, oh, well, that's you know, that's not something that I consciously want to participate in, but yes, I did feel arousal towards it, and it's just because of the way that my limbic system works. It's just a normal fact of the way that our nervous system works. It's important to realize that, especially so that you can become more intelligent about your sexuality. Okay, any other questions? Any questions about this idea? So it's a system because it contains many different parts, including the olfactory bulb, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and even the cerebral cortex plays a role because that's our conscious. So let's write here fast and let's put unconscious. And let's put slow and let's put conscious, just to be clear. Okay. So the other system that we're going to talk about is the part of the brain that keeps the cerebral cortex active. Because I mentioned that the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex is really important, and that if you lose that, then you essentially become what is called brain dead. So this reticular formation has a system, and it's called the reticular activating system. I don't know why they talk about reticular formation and then they talk about the reticular activating system. They're kind of one and the same in your book, but you might hear this as abbreviated as RAS. So this sends a constant stream of action potentials up through the brainstem, so up through the medulla, the pons, up through the middle brain, and to the cerebral cortex. So there's a constant stream of action potentials sent up to the cerebral cortex. And remember that the cerebral cortex is the only part of our conscious part of our brain. So this is what keeps us conscious. Even, however, when we're going to talk about comas, you still have brain activity in the cerebral cortex, so you still have activity in the brain, okay? So this keeps us, and so even when we're asleep, that we're going to have electrical activity. It's going to be different electrical activity when we're asleep, but we're still going to have electrical activity in that part of the brain. So if we look at a diagram that shows this from your book, this shows the neurons that are responsible for this in the hindbrain, and then those arrows just refer to electrical signals that go into the cortex. And this is what gives you the electrical activity in the cortex. So you can hook your head up to electrodes that are able to detect different types of electrical activity, and you might refer to these as brain waves. And you don't need to know the different types of brain waves, but it's kind of interesting when you look at the brain waves between being in deep sleep, for example, and then being awake and alert, but awake versus being relaxed. These theta waves are in the news a lot recently because they're very common in children, but they can also be induced by meditation. And so sometimes they'll talk about, oh, you can change your brain waves by meditating. And so like monks that meditate a lot have a lot more theta waves. So their brain waves are much more like a child's than like other adults that don't meditate. So that is one function of the reticular activating system. The other function is that it also filters out 99% of the sensory information coming into the brain. And this is super important because without this filtering, you could become overstimulated. And so one characteristic of kind of the broad notion of autism is that we have overstimulation. So we can, for example, filter out most of our sensory information and focus on what is important. And if something is repetitive, we kind of stop noticing it, right? So if like we're looking at the lights here, people with autism might be able to see the flickering of the lights. To us, we kind of filter out the fact that these fluorescent lights flicker, although sometimes it can, you know, unconsciously we can kind of can give us headaches over time. But we don't notice that, okay? So the other things that we don't notice is smell, right? So a lot of times we just stop noticing smell, and we'll talk about that when we get to sensory adaptation and we get the sensory system. So smell would be one. Another one is touch. And so sometimes with autistic people, they become overstimulated just simply by sensing the clothes on the surface of their skin. So that can cause them to be overstimulated, and then they either shut down or they act out. So they might scream and run into a corner because the stimulus is just too much for them. So there's this interesting idea specifically for touch that you can provide a touch, and you might have heard of the woman that's done a lot of autistic research. Her name is Temple Grandin. She is an autistic scientist. I don't know if that's how you spell her name. I think that's right. I know Temple's right, but I'm not sure about Grandin. Anyway, she's an autistic scientist, and she's written lots of books, and she does lots of talks. And one of the interesting things is that she thinks she perceives life more like animals do in terms of what they are able to sense. And so she was in she's an animal scientist, specifically an egg researcher. And she would go to slaughterhouses, and she would notice how distraught cows were as they entered the chute to be slaughtered. And she could perceive why they were being overstimulated, why the cows were being overstimulated by their environment. And so she took it upon herself to design more relaxing slaughterhouses for cows, so that the last few moments of going in through the chute into the slaughterhouse was not filled with fear, right? So they were not having the fight or flight. They just can walk in relaxed and then be taken down and killed in a more humane manner. But anyway, one of the things that she's developed is what is called the squeeze chute. And so it's designed kind of for cows, and they walk in and then they provide pressure on their body. And so she's developed this also for autistic people. So they go in, and this machine just kind of provides constant pressure throughout their body, and it causes them to be able to relax. So she's a really interesting person. Who has heard of Temple Grandin? So a few of you. Okay. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about are just some homeostatic imbalances. So seizures are interesting. So we have these seizures that could be very mild. And mild seizures generally do not lead to convulsions. So mild, they're actually called absence seizures. And the reason why they're called absence is it just appears that the person leaves for a moment. And so for example, it could just be a few seconds. It could be maybe a minute where they will lose all emotional facial expressions. So their face will just go blank, and they will stop responding to stimuli. And so that is different from the types of seizures that cause the big epileptic seizures.
like the grand mal seizures. So I'm not sure what I want to call these. Mild versus big seizures. I don't know. What do I want to say?
You can say intense.
Intense, thank you. Seizures. Okay. So these cause convulsions. And so this is generally where people, they can really hurt themselves. They can bite their tongue, right? They can choke. And so you kind of have to give them room. And both of these types of seizures are due to this kind of electrical activity in the brain. So I'll put just spontaneous electrical activity in the brain. And specifically in the cortex. So those mild seizures actually are pretty common in children. And they say that 1 out of every 100 individuals have some form of seizures during their lifetime. So young children could have those absent seizures, and then they just generally tend to go away. But the ones that have the intense convulsions, these tend to not go away. So you can be put on, epileptic drugs that will help to prevent that. And I think I mentioned before that in extreme cases, sometimes they'll go in and they'll sever the corpus callosum. And for some reason, that seems to help when you have these life-threatening seizures occurring. Okay, so this is kind of different than a coma. So when we look at what a coma is an unresponsiveness to sensory stimuli for an extended period of time. If it's brief, then that is called fainting. Right, so that's fainting is unresponsiveness, brief unresponsiveness, unconsciousness. And that is also called syncope. Oops, spelled that wrong. Which means to kind of suddenly stop, right? So fainting can be common, specifically when it has to do with blood pressure. So you probably have all experienced like getting up too quickly and then everything kind of goes white and then you could faint in response to that. Fainting can also be in response to stimuli like blood, right? So one time I made the mistake of when I was younger of actually watching them draw blood. I was like, oh, that's so interesting. And then I fainted. And then ever since then they're like, oh, you're a fainter. Okay, so we're gonna make you lay down, right? Relax.
It's totally different on yourself though, so not to go off on a little tangent, but obviously through the whole EMT thing, I've seen some things that no human should ever see. The other day, I cut my finger pretty good. The doctor told me I might need like 4 stitches, so it wasn't that bad. I saw it and I almost fainted. So it's completely different on yourself.
Yeah.
Totally different.
When you watch it yourself.
Because there's just blood gushing down my hand. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna faint, I'm gonna throw up. Yeah. It's different on yourself.
Yeah. So generally those fainting spells, for some reason my mother was a fainter. I don't know why, but she would just like, seems to be like certain people are more prone to fainting. She's always just like, for every second. Anyway,
this is her blood cells tablets because she would faint on a daily basis.
Oh, interesting.
That is.
Yeah. Okay, so this unresponsiveness does not mean that there's no electrical activity, right? So there's still electrical activity in the cortex. So there's electrical. Okay. So some things that can lead to coma, obviously brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries can cause comas, as can tumors. So brain tumors can cause comas. Infections in the brain can lead to comas as well. So there's a variety of things that can cause a person to go into a coma. And we all know that sometimes we don't, people will just automatically or just weirdly come out of them. after being in them for long periods of time. Okay, so one of the really interesting things about our brain is that it has to undergo sleep. So there are genetic diseases that sometimes cause people to lose the ability to sleep when that part of their brain that controls sleep starts to be broken down. And actually, in Alzheimer's patients, that part of the brain sometimes misfunctions too. And you'll know that, like, sometimes with Alzheimer's, they actually get more active as the sun goes down, and then that's when they wander around and will wander out of the house and lose, themselves, get lost, right? And so sleep is super important, and we didn't understand why sleep was important, but recently what they've discovered is that it actually might help to flush out the toxins, because during sleep there creates a bigger spaces between the individual neurons. And so if you cannot sleep, you will actually die. So there's a genetic disease called fatal familial insomnia, which I think they wrote a book about that recently. There's one family in Europe where it runs in the family. And so when you get to be the age of 40 or 50, it's very common for individuals to lose the ability to sleep. And they start to, if they take sleeping pills, it actually makes it worse. And so they start to just kind of go crazy, and within 6 to 9 months, you die without sleep. So this is an interesting new study, right? This is new, that it actually helps, and it is also important for storing memories. I should point that out too. So sleep is really important after studying, right? Is that you sleep. So pulling an all-nighter and not sleeping sometimes prevents that information from being put into long-term memory where you can more easily recall it. Okay.
What do those people do if they can't sleep and are all exhausted? They just lay around.
I think they kind of go crazy. Yeah, I would imagine that they're physically, you can imagine. Like for me, if I have insomnia, I will lay there, but I still can't sleep, And so I think that would be like the worst death because for me, because when I don't get enough sleep, I don't feel right. Yeah.
How long can you live?
So it's like 6 months, and then you start to go crazy, and then essentially your brain just shuts down and you will die from lack of sleep.
So does it kind of happen suddenly, like you could be, through your 20s and all of a sudden you just can't sleep?
It has a late onset. So the genetic disease, and it's actually kind of associated with prions, which are infectious proteins, but they have a gene that causes this protein to start to infect the area of the brain. And so that sleep center in the brain shrinks and the neurons die. And once that sleep center shrinks, then they can't sleep anymore, right? So it's kind of related a little bit to Alzheimer's too. Okay, so we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about the protection of the central nervous system. And so obviously, one way that we protect our central nervous system is through bones. And so we have the skull, and we also have the vertebrae. So the skull bones protect our brain, and then the vertebrae protect our spinal cord. The spinal cord runs down through the central canal of the vertebrae. And we're going to talk about the spinal cord in more detail. It actually doesn't go all the way down the length of the vertebrae, but the spinal nerves do. So that's what protects the central nervous system. We also have what are called meninges. And that would be the plural. Weirdly, I think it's spelled meninx. This is the singular. So if you're just talking about one of the meninges, you would say the meninx. Okay. So if you see that in your book, that's what that is. Okay, so these are called matters, and matter is spelled with only one T. So the outer one is called the dura mater. So notice there's just one T. And that actually means mother in some language. Is that in Spanish? I don't think so. But that means mother. And so this is like actually means the tough mother. Oops, tough mother. So this is the outermost meningeal layer. It has 2 layers. One of the layers of the dura mater fuses with or connects to the skull of the bone, and that is called the periosteal layer. So peri means around the bone. And so this connects with the connective tissue that is on the outside of the bone, of the skull bone. So this connects to the skull bone. Okay. We also have the meningeal layer. So this is inner to the periosteal layer, and so it would connect to the other meninges, right? So it connects to the other meninges. The function of this dura mater is to help prevent excessive movement of the brain in the skull. So this actually prevents that movement. We're going to talk about the cerebral spinal fluid, which also functions to cushion the brain. So it prevents excessive movement of the brain. Generally, the periosteal and the meningeal layer are fused in most places, but where there's a space, that actually creates a sinus. So we have the dural sinuses. So this is a space, which I'll show you in a minute, and the dural sinuses contain blood that is leaving the brain and is going to return back to the heart to get oxygen and then out to get nutrients. So these contain blood that is leaving the heart. Oh, excuse me, the brain. That is leaving the brain and going to go to the heart. So those are the dural sinuses. They also have partitions, and the partitions are called septa. So this forms partitions. And the septa partition different parts of the brain. So like the cerebellum from the rest of the brain, the brain that sits in the back, that would be partitioned off by a septa, which means wall. Okay, so if we look at this image of the brain, okay, so you can see that the outer dura mater, it's very tough, right? And it's made of connective tissue. And so it has collagen in it. And then you can see the sinus in it. So the sinuses are where there is blood that is returning from the brain and is being stored there before it's going to be taken out by blood vessels. And then we have those partitions. And so you don't need to know the name of the different partitions, but just know that it is the dura mater that helps to partition off, right, the different parts of the brain. Okay, so if we were to look at this in more detail, okay, so this is a diagram from your book. And I think I meant to print this out, but I didn't, so we'll just label it. So this right here is the bone, right? This right here is the periosteal layer. right? This right here would be my dural sinus. So it contains blue because blue means unoxygenated. Okay. So that's the outer part. Actually, I pointed to the bone incorrectly. Sorry. There's my bone. There's my periosteal layer. This is the meningeal layer.
The book says that the blue is something different.
Okay, that is one of the dural sinuses. They just call it, that's just the specific sinus it is. But it is a dural sinus, yeah.
Okay,
Okay,
we just need to know dural sinus.
yes.
Okay.
So that is a dural sinus. So sagittal just means down through the middle. So it's a sagittal section, so that's just a specific one of those dural sinuses. Okay, so the next layer
Is called arachnoid matter.
Why do you think what does arachnoid mean? Spider, right? And so when we look at the arachnoid, it has these fibers that extend down like a spider's web. So we have what is referred to as the subarachnoid space. So this is, the arachnoid matter is the middle layer. You might want to write that down in your notes under the dura mater, right? And we have the subarachnoid space. So one of the things that you'll see in the subarachnoid space, so underneath the arachnoid matter, is blood vessels.
And so this is where we have capillaries.
So there's capillaries that supply the brain with oxygen and nutrients. And we're going to talk about how special those capillaries are because they're not very porous. Because we need to control the stuff that comes into the brain. So we'll talk about what is called the blood-brain barrier in a minute. Okay.
So this is where the cerebrospinal fluid is located. So this is my, so in there we have, this is fluid filled and it's called the cerebrospinal fluid. And this helps to cushion the brain.
So we're going to talk about how that
Cerebrospinal fluid is produced in a little bit. And then the innermost layer that follows the grooves and the ridges, this is called the pia mater. So this would be my pia mater. So this is like the soft mother.
spider mother, the soft mother. So pia is just the actual layer of connective tissue that is on top of the brain. So when we did our brain dissection, I wanted to get the brains that actually had the meninges attached, but they were out, sold out. So I got the brains where most of the meninges had been removed. You might have been able to see parts of that dura mater in between the hemispheres or underneath where the pituitary gland was sitting. That would have been part of the dura mater. And then the pia mater is just on the surface of the brain.
So one thing that can happen, right, with the brain is that you could have traumatic brain injuries,
like bruising of the brain. So this is just a diagram of a person that has hit their head against a fixed object, so they were moving. And one of the things that the brain can do is it can actually be damaged where you hit, but the brain moves a little bit in the skull. And so it can actually also kind of bounce off the back of the skull, and then you get a brain injury on the back. Okay? So a contusion is simply just a brain bruise where you might get a little bit of hemorrhaging, and it's less severe
than a concussion. And so some of the things, this can cause you to lose consciousness temporarily, right? A brain injury like this. They're obviously really worried about brain injuries in terms of sports, because what they're finding is that specifically high contact sports like football, is they're finding that people get to their 40s and they have severe brain damage because their brain has been bouncing around because of all the blows to it. Same thing with boxing, and specifically with children. Now what they do is that if you have a child that like plays soccer or football, they actually give them a test on a computer to see how their brain works. And then if they think that they have gotten a concussion from the sport, they'll actually make them go back in and take the test again to see if they can like register a difference in their ability to like think and perceive and see. You know, you could lose vision, you could get dizzy, right? And so they take concussions very seriously, right? You have to stay home from school if you have a concussion now. So before it wasn't a big deal, but now they're realizing that these minor little concussions that occur over your lifespan could actually lead to kind of additive brain damage. And so a contusion, if I can spell that. This is a bruise or bleeding of the brain. Whereas a concussion is simply a broader scale of brain damage. So contusions are less severe than a concussion. Okay. So let's talk about the cerebral spinal fluid. So CSF, the abbreviation for cerebrospinal fluid. So you have in your body at any given time about 150 milliliters of fluid. So that's like half a cup of cerebral spinal fluid they have in your body. It is continually produced and circulated, so they believe that it is replaced about every 8 hours.
Is that why, like, when you go and have a kid, they give you an epidural? They say it's only going to last 8 hours because your body's going to replace it? Or is that because the drug itself will wear off?
You know, I don't know. That's a good question. I know, well, I was going to mention that sometimes if you get an epidural and it punctures if it goes too, so epidural would mean that's upon the dura mater. So that means that it doesn't actually penetrate down to where the cerebral spinal fluid is. So if it actually penetrates to where the cerebral spinal fluid is, you can get leakage. And so one danger of an epidural is that some of your cerebral spinal fluid might leak out. And what that generally does is it makes people have wicked headaches. And so they have to lay up, here so that they keep the cerebral spinal fluid here and not down here. And sometimes they have to put extra fluid in to counteract the leakage of the cerebral spinal fluid. But I don't think it has to do with the cerebral spinal fluid. I just think that the probably breaks down. Your liver probably breaks it down by then. Okay. So it is produced by the choroid plexus. And there's a choroid plexus in every ventricle. So remember, there's actually 4 ventricles in the brain, the 2 lateral, the 3rd, and the 4th. And so there's these choroid plexuses. So this is vascular. So this is capillaries. And they're surrounded by the type of glial cells called the ependymal cells. So that's a glial cell that we talked about. And you remember that the ependymal cells have cilia. And so if I were to draw my little cell here, it has cilia. And those cilia actually move to help circulate the fluid. So the cilia help to circulate. So the cerebrospinal fluid is derived from blood. And so it has to be, when it's used and the oxygen and the nutrients and have come back out of it, then it has to be taken back to the blood. And so we have what are called arachnoid granulations. And I don't really like this name. It used to be arachnoid villi, which looked more like it is. So these are the arachnoid granulations. And these reabsorb the CSF. So they actually hang down, little structures that reabsorb it. And then that fluid goes back to the dura sinuses, the sinuses, and then it gets drained back into the circulatory system by the jugular veins. So if we were to look at a picture of this, so this is where you have the cerebrospinal fluid. This right here would be the dural sinuses. This is my cerebrospinal fluid right here. So one of the functions of the cerebrospinal fluid is to cushion the brain, right? It cushions the brain, but it also delivers nutrients and oxygen to the tissues in the brain as well. So it kind of bathes everything. And so if we were to look at where the choroid plexus is, this is my choroid plexus. So we looked at that in lab, in the model and in the dissection. There's also these choroid plexuses down here by the cerebellum that produce cerebrospinal fluid as well. So if we were to look at this, this is my capillary. So this is in the choroid plexus. These are my ependymal cells. And so in order for things to get into the cerebrospinal fluid, they actually have to go through this layer of ependymal cells. And ependymal cells actually prevent stuff that could be harmful, like drugs or toxins, or maybe infectious agents, like maybe bacteria, from getting into the brain, into the cerebrospinal fluid. So they layer the outside, but they also help, because they have those cilia, they help to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So those areas show the way that the fluid moves in the brain, and it goes down through that central canal. So it's around, right, around the central, or around the spinal cord, but also down through the central canal. So that is in the subarachnoid space right here. So an epidural, I will talk about this, but an epidural does not go through the dura mater, right? It's just upon the dura. However, when you get a spinal tap, a spinal tap is the removal of cerebrospinal fluid. So say if you have meningitis, meningitis is very dangerous because it's an infection in the meninges that can eventually go into the brain, right? So itis just means inflammation of the meninges. And so if they want to find out what is causing the meningitis, then they might do a spinal tap to see if the infectious agent is in the cerebrospinal fluid. And then you can also talk about patch, so a spinal patch.
How is meningitis transmitted? Like, is it airborne?
I think it can be bacterial, but it can also be viral.
Because the high school my brother goes to, actually, they had an outbreak of meningitis, like in 3 high schools that surrounded it, and like 3 kids died from it.
Right.
It's huge, and they like shut down school for a week, and they had to have you know, like those big tents that come and completely reclean the whole school and stuff. So I was just curious how it was.
It must be, if it's that contagious, then it must be something that's spread maybe through particles in the air. I'm not sure. That's a good question. So a spinal patch is where they add fluid. So this is when fluid is lost. So when fluid has leaked out. And this could be due to an epidural.
Yes.
Are there other instances in which people lose spinal fluid? Or
You
is it
know, that's a good
primarily
question. I
epidural?
imagine if you have damage to your spinal cord, like if you had traumatic injury to that could affect it. And maybe even infection. I was thinking about that. Can meningitis cause fluid to leak? That might be also. If those membranes are damaged, then the fluid might not be produced or circulated properly.
Well, and then how you were saying with like the epidural, if the spinal fluid leaks, like will the spinal fluid make your body sick? Like will your body recognize that?
What happens is that when you sit up, after that happens, there's not enough cerebral spinal fluid in your brain because it comes down because of gravity. And so what I've heard is it's like excruciating. It's horrible. Yeah. So you're on your back. Yeah. Yeah. So that's how important that half cup of fluid in your brain is, right? It's super important.
Isn't the needle like this long with these things? Yeah, no, I'm good.
Well, no, it's like that. Not long.
That's a spinal tap is a much bigger needle.
Maybe
Yeah,
that's
never drunk one like that long.
yeah, and I'm already dying from having a kid. Yeah, just poke me in the back. I'll just push this away.
Okay.
Ooh.
So the other thing to talk about is what is called the blood-brain barrier. So this is a little bit different than the cerebral spinal barrier, which has the ependymal cells. But this has to do with the fact that the capillaries are less leaky in the brain. So we talked about capillaries last quarter, but capillaries are where nutrients and stuff gets exchanged with the interstitial fluid. So the capillaries are less leaky. So bad bad stuff can't enter the interstitial fluid in the brain. Okay, so bad stuff could be drugs, right? Alcohol can actually get across the blood-brain barrier. We don't want bacteria and viruses to get across. And we also need to regulate the ion concentrations very carefully with the neurons because we learned how important those ion concentrations are in producing an action potential. So the ion concentrations in the surrounding the neurons is different than it is elsewhere in the interstitial fluid of the body in general. So we also have the fact that there are astrocytes. So I'll just put they also participate in creating a boundary. So a good example, I think, in my own lifetime about like a drug that used to be widely used is Benadryl. So when I was a kid, that was like the only antihistamine you had. So like if you had allergies, you were taking Benadryl, and you probably, if you had taken Benadryl, you will remember it because it makes you really sleepy, right? And it really affects your ability to stay awake. So Benadryl actually crosses this blood-brain barrier, right? And makes you sleepy, and it affects your ability to think. And so being on antihistamines as a child, because I had really bad, severe allergies, was a really awful thing, right? So then when they developed these new allergy medicines, it was like, hallelujah, right? It was like, oh my God. Like, is anybody, you're probably not old enough to remember this, but like, so when Claritin first came out, or Allegra, right? Those were just like, it was just such a relief to be able to take an antihistamine that is gonna not knock you out, right? So we still sometimes take Benadryl, and it is in the nighttime allergy or cold medicines, like nighttime NyQuil has Benadryl. It does what? Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So it makes you feel weird, right? Because it crosses that blood-brain barrier. So antihistamines that you develop a drug that doesn't do that, but still has the effect of an antihistamine, it was huge. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today, and then we'll talk about the spinal cord on Wednesday.